Hey, how's it going everybody? Hope you're all doing well. Welcome to part 6 on a series where I show you how to build a simple modern habit tracker called consistency. Now in the last video, we basically synced up the front-end goals component with the backend server and saved the data in Redux. In this video, we start the exciting process of building out a fully functional user authentication system. It works pretty much as you would expect it to. Enter your information and you're signed in. Obviously you can sign out. Now for the scope of just this video, we're only going to be building out the entire front end for the registration component. And in future videos, we'll handle the back end, saving the user to the database, creating JWTs, and storing the user in a session. For now, let's look at what we need to get done in order to complete the front end of this component. Let's start off by creating the register route and a basic form component. If you've been following along since my first video, you know how I like to set up my components. Let's create a new folder called user. Inside of user, let's create another new folder called register. And we're also going to be in the future be creating sign-in, so might as well make that now too. Make a folder for that, but we're only working with this one for now. So let's create an index.js and also create a register.jsx. Let's export default from register, save that. And I'm just going to put some boilerplate code here. Okay, we got a bare bones functional component. Before we build on this, let's add it to the routes. So in app.js, let's copy this habits routes down, change this to register, and change the component to register, and let's auto import that. There we go. All right, our register route works as expected. Let's continue building out the component. You may also know that I don't like to bore you guys with a bunch of CSS. So as I make these styled components, I'm just going to be pasting the CSS that I have from the demo project and explain briefly what they are. So let's start by importing styled from styled components. And as usual, we're going to start top down. So let's create the page container. Let's actually create the styled component for that. And in here, all we're adding is padding top of 10 pixels. So continuing inside a page container, we're going to have a page title, which is consistency. And let's real quick just create the styled component for that one. So for this, we're going to have a font size of 30 pixels, padding bottom of 10 pixels, and padding left of 100 pixels, which makes it look like this so far. And now we can start in the actual form part. So let's create a register container, const register container equals style.div. And again, we're going to be using flexbox, so we'll set it display to flex direction column, because everything is flowing from top to bottom, as you can see here, and align items to center. Next, let's create the form title, which is going to be register, create the styled component for that one, and give it some font size and padding bottom. So far, so good. Now, the register container contains the entire form, including the form title. Now let's actually create the form container. I know the naming could probably be better here, but whatever. For this container, we're going to justify all the content as flex start so that it starts all the way on the left side and restrict the width to only 14%. Now let's add a label here and an input. We'll put the value as first name. The input type will be text. We'll give it an ID of first name, a placeholder of first name, and let's give it a max length of 25 characters. Let's see what this looks like so far. All right, it's coming along. So since we're going to be having the same styling for each pair of label and input, we're just going to wrap both of those things in one little styled component. So to wrap around these guys, let's put a styled component called input section. Let's also just put first name here. And let's style this input section. All right, I'm going to do this one in chunks so you can see what actually changes here. So we're going to put display to flex and flex direction to column once again. And now the input box spans the entire width of its parent. We'll also put some margin bottom of 15 pixels for the entire input section. And just for the label, we're going to give it margin bottom of 5 pixels. So here's the change. Now let's target the input and give it some padding of 5 pixels. Make the border 2 pixels solid E3, E3, E3. And when the input box is in focus, we want to give it a green outline and we don't want any border. So now here's what it looks like. Without the focus, it's gray. And when it's in focus, it's green. This part's pretty straightforward. Let's just copy this down for all the fields that we'll need. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, I've copied it down 5 times and let's start changing the values now. All right, guys, so for each input section, all I did was change the label name, the HTML4, the placeholder, and the ID. And also a few little changes that I'm going to make now. Make sure you set the password input field to type password. And I'm actually going to get rid of the maximum length for the passwords. They'll make it as long as they want, I guess. And for the email, instead of max length 25, I want max length 50. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Okay, it's coming along. Let's add this submit button in there now. To do that, let's just make a button container styled component. And in this button container, we're going to actually have our submit button styled component. Okay, the reason I'm doing a button container first is so that we can first position the button in the correct spot of the form and then submit button to style the actual CSS of the button itself. So let's create both of these above. Const button container equals style.div. And let's copy this down and do the same for submit button. Okay, so like I said, button container is just to actually position the button in the right spot. So we're going to give it display flex, justify content center, and margin bottom 15 pixels. For submit button, we have a little bit more CSS, like the background color as that green. We're not going to give it any border. We'll have a border radius of 2 pixels, padding 8 pixels on the top and bottom, and 10 pixels on right and left. The text color is going to be white. Font family and font size, it'll inherit from the parent. And when we focus on the button, we don't want any outline and we don't want any border. Let's add some text in here and take a look. Cool. Let's add this other text down here that will ultimately redirect us to the login component. After the entire form container, let's just put a simple div that has some text saying already have an account. And now we actually want to use a link component. If you just type lin and hit tab on this one, it'll auto import the link from React Router DOM, and that's the one that we want to use. So in this link, we're just going to say login here. And for the link component, we need to give it a link to redirect to. So we'll give it /signin. Let's save it and have a look. All right, let's style this link over here as well. So instead of having a link, let's change this to a styled link and create a styled component for this one above. So just to show you, it auto imported link from React Router DOM. And to style that using styled components, we can actually just say const styled link equals styled. And then instead of saying .div, we can actually put brackets and put any kind of component in here. This is one of the reasons why I really like styled components, because you can do stuff like this. And then for styling the link, we'll have text decoration none, color to that green color, and font weight to bold. If you want to add a little space here between login and the question mark, we can just manually put a string here. Okay, so that's looking pretty good so far. All right, so we've done step 1 of this process. We've created the register route and a basic form component. The next thing that we're going to be doing is adding component state to register. All right, so to store our state, we're obviously going to be using the hook called useState. Bam. Let's also import useState from React. And now we could create a separate state for every input field here. So like one state for first name, last name, email, password, and all that. But to make it easier, I'm just going to make one state called user info. All right, we'll make this set user info, and the initial state is going to be an object. All right, this is how we're going to store all the fields at once. We're going to have the first name be an empty string and everything else be an empty string as well. Last name, email, password, and password confirmation. Keep in mind that the names that we're using for the keys of this object have to be the exact same names as the IDs of all of the input fields. And you'll see why in just a second when we start updating the state. I think one thing I noticed is I used confirm password down here, but up there I used password confirmation. So let's just change that real quick. So now how do we actually change this user info state? Well, in the input fields, we can give it an onChange property, and we'll make this equal to a function. And we're going to write that function above in just a sec. We'll call it handle user info change. Getting reminders to take care of my cat. So let's create this function up here. Const handle user info change equals, and it's going to obviously be an arrow function. And so the first thing that we want to do in here is deconstruct some values that are coming from the event. First one is ID and the second one is value. So this will be coming from e.target. All right, value is going to be whatever value the input field has. So now that we have ID and value, let's call set user info. And instead of passing it an object and saying ID value like this, what we want to do is take the current value of user info and change it so that the ID is equal to value. So let's use an arrow function to do this. And let's also pass current state as a parameter to this function. It will automatically pass whatever value user info currently has as this value here. And what we want to do is return an object where we take the current value of user state. So take all the key value pairs from current state and modify it so that ID has value. So now just to see what's going on here, let's just console log what user info is in this function. All right, so I have my console open and let's see what happens when we start entering stuff in here. As you can see, the console log shows that our user info state has all the different attributes we need and it's changing the values as we go. So let's go ahead and use handle user info change in the other input fields as well. We're just going to copy this and put it inside of all of the input fields. Let's quickly see if it console logs for each field. And as you can see, the user info state is being updated anytime the user types in those fields. So now we have one object that contains everything we need, and we can check number 2 off the list. The next step is to create the slice for register. All right, let's just close some of these files that we don't need open right now. We don't need app or index. So the process of creating this state is going to be very similar to what we did in the last video for the goals state. So inside of the users folder, and not just the register folder itself, we're going to create a new file called userslice.js. Let's start by importing create slice from redux.js/toolkit. So let's save it in const user slice. And then here we'll call create slice. And remember, create slice takes an object, which has a bunch of different options in it. We're going to start off with the name. The name will be just user. Next, we need an initial state. And we're going to set a constant for this above, and we'll call it init user state. Next, we want reducers. For now, they'll be empty. And then we'll want extra reducers eventually to handle the actions that are going to be coming from create async thunk. Okay, so let's create this init user state up here. Const init user state. Again, this is going to be an object with some fields in it. The first field that we obviously need to track is the logged in user. So this is going to store the first name, last name, email, and all that stuff once the user does log in, but initially it'll be null. And then, so for this part, we need 2 states. We need one for register state, and we're going to eventually make another state for sign in state, but we'll just start off with the register just to keep the scope of this video only for registering. Now, as the user is registering, there are a couple different things that we'll need to track. We need to track the loading state of the register request. It's going to start off as idle. We need to track the error state of this request. It'll be null beginning. And lastly, we need one more field. It's going to be called current request ID, and it's going to be set to undefined. Now, the reason that we have this field is to basically ensure that the user is not sending multiple requests to our server at the same time. And once we get to the error handling in our asynchronous function, you'll see why this field comes in handy. So lastly, let's just export default userslice.reducer. And the reason we're exporting this is because inside of the store.js file, we need to register that reducer that we just created with inside of the configure store function. So let's import. It'll be called user reducer from components / goals, sorry, not goals, user slice. And let's add a user field to our configure store and let it use the user reducer. So now let's save this, and let's take a look at the browser console. All right, so as you can see here, the logged in user is null because no one's logged in, and the register state starts off like this as we expect. Now let's continue, because remember, ultimately what we're trying to do is take this user info that was entered in the form and send it to an action, and that action will then be responsible for calling the API. If you recall from the last video, in goal slice, we had an async thunk, which had a type parameter and an asynchronous function, and the async function is where the API request actually happens. So we're going to do something very, very similar for user slice. Okay, let's import create async thunk, and let's use it in a constant. Const, and then the name that I give it here is going to be the name of the action that we will eventually dispatch to the store. This action is going to be called register user. Now let's use create async thunk, and remember, it takes 2 parameters. The first one is a string that represents the type of the request that we're sending, and this will be user/register. And the second parameter it takes is an asynchronous function, that will handle our request. Now, if you don't remember exactly what create async thunk does, in a nutshell, it basically generates a thunk action creator, okay, which gets saved in register user. And once you dispatch that thunk action creator to the store, it'll automatically dispatch the lifecycle actions for you, such as pending, fulfilled, and rejected, after running the asynchronous function that was given as the second parameter here. Now, if that doesn't really make sense, I recommend going back and watching the previous part of this series once again, because I went into a little bit of detail explaining how this works. So moving on, our asynchronous function is going to take two parameters. One is going to be the user info that is passed from our component, and the second is the thunk API that the middleware will automatically pass into our asynchronous function for us. Let's close this, and I forgot the letter C here. And because we need to access some variables that are in the initial state, let's move this async function down here. So what are we doing in the body of this function? Let's comment it out first. First, let's do some error handling. Then we're going to have a try catch where we are going to make the API call to /register. Okay, so what kind of errors are we going to be handling? First of all, we want to make sure that the loading state of register is pending. Okay, in other words, before we make this API call, we want to make sure that the loading state was changed to pending. So to do that, we need to access this state, first of all, from the Redux store. And that's where Thunk API comes in handy. So let's destructure loading from Thunk API .get state. And this is a function that's within Thunk API. And now that we have the state, we can get the register state and get the loading from that. So let's put our if statement for if loading is not equal to pending, then we will just return. So if this asynchronous function runs and the loading state is not yet pending, then we're just going to return because we don't want to run the API call just yet. So there's one more state to error handle for, but we need to do one thing before this. Remember how I said when we dispatch the thunk action creator, it will automatically dispatch a pending action to our store. So let's handle that pending action that's going to be coming from register user first. So to write the reducer for this, we need to first specify which action to handle, and that's going to be register user dot pending. And now let's write the reducer that will be called when this action hits the store. Remember that a reducer takes a state and an action, and it will return a modified state. So once pending is dispatched to the store, we want to basically set the loading state from idle to pending. So first of all, we need to get that state. Let's destructure register state from state. This is passed in as a variable, and we're just getting the register state from it. And now let's check if register state dot loading is idle. Then we want to change register state dot loading to pending, and another equal sign up here. Now, one more thing to do in this reducer is set the current request ID. Remember how I mentioned earlier, this will come in handy when we do error checking to make sure that the user isn't sending multiple requests at the same time. So now is where we actually set the current request ID. And that request ID is going to be coming from the metadata in the action. So here's what I mean. Let's set register state dot current request ID to action dot meta dot request ID. Now you don't need to worry about making this ID yourself because generating that ID is another thing that create async thunk does for us. So let's go back to that second case that we need to error handle. The check that we're going to do here is if the thunk API dot request ID is not the same as current request ID, then we want to return. And we also need to destructure current request ID from the register state. So basically what this means is the request ID that Thunk API generates has to be the same as the current request ID that's set within the register state. If it's not the same, that means there's a different request that's being sent and we don't want to run the async function, so we'll just return. Okay, that's the logic there. So now let's finally make the API call. Let's set response equal to await, and we're going to use Axios again to make the API call. So let's import Axios from Axios. And here we can put dot post, because this time we're actually sending data to the server, and we're going to be sending it to the user/register route, which we haven't written yet, but we're going to be doing that in a bit. And the second parameter we can give here is, as you can see here, some data that we want to send. So we're going to send user info, and all of the user info validation is going to be happening on the back end. And then we can just return response.data. And for catching the error, we're going to do what we did in the goal slice as well, which is to get this function called reject with value from the Thunk API. And we're just going to return reject with value error.response.data. So whatever error is thrown from the API will be caught over here and will be sent to the store. So going back to the extra reducers, we made the reducer that handles the pending action dispatched to the store. Let's go ahead and continue handling the fulfilled and rejected cases. So after pending, we can copy this down twice, once for fulfilled and once for pending. So first, let's handle the rejected action. So if this action was dispatched to the store, we need to do a couple things. First of all, we need to check if the state is in pending. If that's the case, then we can change the loading state back to idle, because even though it's rejected, the loading is finished. And we can set the current request ID back to undefined. And we can also set register state.error equal to action.payload. Okay, and then whatever error is stored in here, we can handle that in our component later. So let's go to the fulfilled action. So if fulfilled is dispatched to the store, again, we want to check if loading is pending. We'll set loading back to idle. We'll set current request ID back to undefined. Let's copy this down. And if there are any errors, we can set that back to null. And lastly, we can set state.loggedinuser to action.payload. Okay, so whatever information is returned from the backend after the request is fulfilled, it's going to be saved in action.payload, and we can set that to loggedinuser. Notice how I'm putting state.loggedinuser and not register state, because looking back to our initial state, register state does not contain a logged in user property. The property we are trying to access is one level above it. That reminds me, another quick thing that I missed was after this get state function, we go directly to register state, but we have to say .user first, because within the user, we have the register state. Okay, so now if you try to go to the Google console and see what happens when we hit submit, we can see that the Redux state has no actions being dispatched. If you don't know why this is happening, I encourage you to pause it here and try to figure out why. But basically, the reason is because we made this async thunk here, but we didn't export it and we didn't use it within our component. So let's export register user, save this file, and go into the register file so we can use that. So let's quickly import register user from components /user slice. And we need to basically dispatch this thunk action once the register button is submitted. So let's give this button a type of submit. And we want to do something on click. And that something is going to be a function called handle submit. All right, so let's write that above here. So const handle submit is an arrow function that's going to dispatch our function for us. Now, remember from the goals component, to dispatch an action, we need to first get dispatch by setting const dispatch equal to use dispatch. Use dispatch. There we go. And it should have auto imported that as well. Let's double check that. It did. So let's take register user, that thunk action, and after we dispatch, we can give register user as the thunk action that we want to dispatch. And remember, register user takes one parameter. It's going to be user info, which is the local state that's inside of the register component. So it's going to take all of this data and pass it along into the register user thunk action. All right, let's save this for now and take a look at what's happening. So if we hit register, by the way, I don't like how we don't see a pointer here. So let me quickly go to the button and add a cursor pointer. There we go. Now we have that pointer here, and let's hit register. So we can see that we got rejected, which is a good thing because we haven't built the backend yet, so that makes sense. And we can see that within the state, we have an error state and the loading is back to idle. Okay, so just to see that our request could be handled correctly, let's create a very, very quick backend. So let's set app.post because we want to handle a post request. And the URL that we're going to be posting to is user/ register. And the function that's going to handle this is going to have a request and a response, just as you can see below. And in here, let's set some const user equal to an object that has a name parameter or a name property. Set it to my name. And let's set response.send to user. So now we just made a very, very simple endpoint. So if we send a post request to this URL, we should get this one object back. So let's see if that happens, just to see if our request is being sent properly. So if we hit register, we can see that we got a fulfilled action and logged in user is set to that object that was returned from the backend. So this is the behavior that we want, but obviously this is far from complete. We just have the front end component done along with Redux. All right, so now we can check off the last item that I wanted to develop for this video, which was to create that async thunk for the login and handle the different actions that would be dispatched from create async thunk. So a very quick summary of what we've done here. We just created the front end for the register component, and we added local component state to it that holds the user information that's entered in the form. And then once the user hits register, we dispatch a thunk action creator to the store, and it handles the loading and error states for our API request to the /register endpoint. And as a result, we can see that in Redux, we're holding the fake user information that was returned from the backend, and we're also tracking the loading and error states as well. So there was quite a bit of front-end development that happened in this video. If you guys have any questions about anything that I did in here, feel free to leave a comment below. Or if there's anything that I could have handled in a better way and I might not be using the best practices, also feel free to let me know that below. In the next video, we're going to be doing the error handling for the user information that's sent from the front end, and obviously very much enhancing the backend over here. If you guys watched all the way to the end of this video, thank you very much. I hope you guys learned anything new from this video, and if you did, feel free to like and subscribe so you can follow along with the process of building out this project. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.